All right, today we're diving into a really fascinating and pretty complex psychoanalytic theory. It's all about how a collective identity gets formed, how it can break apart, and how it gets put back together when faced with massive trauma. We're going to explore a story of two different catastrophes, and the two, frankly, ingenious solutions or knots that were invented to hold an entire society's psyche together.
I mean, think about it for a second. It's a huge question. When the very symbols that give your entire culture meaning are just gone, what stops everything from completely falling apart? This is the core problem the analysis we're looking at today tries to solve, and the answer it comes up with is pretty radical. Okay, so before we go any further, we've got to get this one key term down. It comes from the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, and it's called the sinthome. So imagine the human psyche is made of three interconnected rings: the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. A major trauma can just blow them apart. A sinthome is like a fourth ring, a clever knot that's invented to tie them all back together. And this part's crucial. It's not a cure for the trauma. Not at all. It's a whole new way to function with it.
So here's our game plan. We're going to start by looking at that first knot, one that was tied thousands of years ago. Then we'll get into the cataclysm that ripped it apart, the second knot that was invented to replace it, and finally, we'll see how this new knot actually works in the world today.
So, let's go way back to the first catastrophe. According to this theory, this whole story kicks off not with some abstract idea, but with a real traumatic event that literally threatened to dissolve an entire people.
So in the year 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Now, in psychoanalytic terms, you got to understand, this wasn't just a building. It was the absolute center, the symbolic anchor holding the whole collective psyche together. Its destruction created this massive void, a hole in the symbolic order. The risk was a total collective breakdown. And the solution? It was an incredible invention, a brand new form of Judaism, one based not on a physical place, but on an endless, portable world of text.
And this is what the source material calls the first sinthome, Rabbinic Judaism. You see, it wasn't just a religion. It was a really sophisticated piece of psychological engineering. It was a kind of know-how built for survival, a knot specifically designed to function perfectly in a state of homelessness, of being in exile.
Now here's where it gets really clever. This is how the knot actually worked. It retied all three of those psychic rings. So for the symbolic, the lost temple was swapped out for the infinite process of debating the Talmud. For the real, the messy, overwhelming stuff of life, it created Jewish law, Halakha, which is this incredibly detailed set of rituals to contain and manage all those intense experiences. And for the imaginary, it created a new self-image, this identity of being a remnant, a chosen group that was left over for God.
And this quote just perfectly captures the kind of identity that this knot produced over hundreds and hundreds of years. The source uses this pop culture reference as a kind of modern shorthand for the diasporic Jew, an identity built on text, on debate, on intellect, instead of on land or physical strength.
And this is the key takeaway here. This passivity wasn't a flaw. It was the whole point. It was a survival mechanism. This knot was specifically engineered to turn all conflict, all aggression inward. It channeled it away from dangerous physical fights and into the safe, endless world of arguing over texts. And you know what? It worked. For almost 2,000 years. Until, well, it didn't. Because a new trauma was coming, one that was so fundamentally different from the first that the old knot, the one woven from text and passivity, would be completely and utterly torn apart.
Okay, this slide is absolutely central to the entire analysis. The first trauma was what's called a symbolic lack. A key symbol, the temple, was missing. But the second trauma, the Shoah, was a completely different beast. The source calls it a real surplus, not a missing symbol, but an overwhelming excess of horror, a hole in reality itself that words and symbols just couldn't process.
And the source brings in Lacan here to really hammer this point home. The Shoah wasn't something you could interpret or debate or fit into a symbolic framework. It was an event completely excluded from sense, just this raw, meaningless horror erupting from the real.
And all of a sudden, the very thing that had ensured survival for millennia, that passivity, was exposed as a catastrophic liability. An identity built to turn conflict inward is totally helpless against an external force of industrial-scale murder. The first knot just broke.
So the breaking of that first knot created a psychic emergency. A collective psychosis was a real danger. According to this theory, a new knot had to be invented out of sheer necessity. And this analysis frames Zionism not primarily as a political movement, but as that very psychoanalytical solution.
Yeah, this wasn't some casual choice. It was an urgent act of psychological survival. A new sinthome had to be forged to tie the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary back together after they'd been blown apart by the trauma of the Shoah.
Okay, this table right here is the intellectual heart of this whole explainer. It shows step by step how the new knot, Zionism, systematically replaced every single function of the old one. So in the symbolic realm, the divine law of Halakha gets replaced by the secular law of the state. In the imaginary, the passive diasporic Jew is replaced by the active new Jew, the Sabra. And most critically, in the real, the old strategy of containing trauma through ritual was replaced by a new one, actively repeating it through military power.
And the result, as you can see, is a total 180-degree flip of the collective self-image. Where the old identity was all about text, the new one is all about land. Where the old was passive, the new is active. Where the old was intellectual, the new is muscular.
And the source uses that comparison again, but this time it's with Paul Newman's character from the movie Exodus, and it just makes this shift crystal clear. The neurotic Woody Allen persona, which became identified with the failure of the diaspora, is thrown out and replaced by the powerful Paul Newman persona, a new, strong, land-based ideal.
So here's the absolute core of this new knot and its relationship to trauma. It doesn't try to contain or make sense of the horror of the Shoah. Instead, it externalizes it. The source uses this incredibly powerful phrase, it's a machine for the conversion of grief into power, channeling that unbearable trauma into military action and the building of a state.
So how does all this abstract theory actually play out on the ground? Well, in this last section, we're going to look at how the source connects this psychoanalytic knot to real, observable data about mental health and resilience in modern Israeli society. And it is so important that we remember this definition as we go into the final part. A sinthome is not a failure. It's not something to be fixed. According to this theory, it's the specific, unique way a psyche learns to function with its trauma. So the things we're about to see aren't problems to be cured, they are expressions of the knot doing its job.
Now this is really interesting. Check out this clinical data. A 2024 study found that before the October 7th attacks, the descendants of Holocaust survivors actually had pretty normal rates of PTSD. But after the attacks, their rates more than doubled, while the control group's rates stayed the same. The theory explains this as latent vulnerability. Basically, the Zionist sinthome holds the trauma dormant, but a powerful new trauma can reactivate it, causing that original wound to burst through to the surface.
You know, sociological studies often point out this seeming paradox in Israel. You have these very high rates of collective anxiety right alongside incredibly high levels of social resilience. Well, this theory completely resolves that paradox. They aren't opposites at all. The anxiety is the trauma that the knot is constantly working to manage. The resilience is the strength and the effectiveness of the knot itself. You can't have one without the other. They're two sides of the same coin.
And all of this leaves us with a final, really powerful question. The analysis we've walked through today presents national identity not as a set of beliefs, but as a functional, psychoanalytic structure, a knot tied specifically to manage an unbearable wound. And it forces us to ask, if that's what a national identity is, what happens when the world starts pulling on the knot itself?